So we've been going through the Battle of Raphia, identifying the fulfillment of prophecy, and we've been doing so for a number of purposes. As we've stated, to demonstrate the correctness and the integrity of our message, but also as something of an exercise of identifying what fulfillments of prophecy look like, and being able to being given an example of what it takes, the type of work that is needed to connect the prophetic predictions to their fulfillments. And we've made the point that if you are not watching the developments in relation to those prophetic symbols you're seeking to understand, if you're not watching the developments in relation to the prophetic symbols that are involved in the fulfillment, those fulfillments become very hard to see. You won't see them. But even where there's been a clear fulfillment, it does require some work in digging, in looking through recent history to make the connections through our models. Right, so in our consideration of the Battle of Raphia, of course we understand it's a war over spheres of influence based on the type, based on the type, which is the ancient Battle of Raphia. We started identifying the spheres of influence that Russia and the United States have been in conflict over. Right, and of course the model teaches us that we should see the king of the south, which in our line is Russia. We should see the king of the south gaining marked victories. We identified 6 spheres of influence that we want to cover. These are Syria, Turkey, Ukraine, Libya, Venezuela, and Africa. Right, and we had come as far as Libya, and we're going to go to continue on to Venezuela. But I was asked to recap. I think specifically Libya and Turkey. Some said I moved a bit fast, so I'll explain it again. Right, so remember the concept is we're looking for a fulfillment in 2019. Where we see the king of the south gaining a victory against the king of the north over a sphere of influence. But the fulfillments that we're seeing in 2019, we can see their beginning. Right, the developments in connection with the fulfillment, we can see them beginning in 2014, which is the beginning of this dispensation. Right, so with Turkey, we identified that Turkey is an important sphere of influence between the West and Russia. I think we read many news articles. I won't be reading those quotes again. The notes have been sent out as well. The notes have been sent out on WhatsApp. So if you're not part of those groups, I'm sure there's some brethren who can get those notes to you. Right. But I'll just explain it, that Turkey is an important sphere of influence to Russia and the West. It lies in that middle ground between Europe and between Europe and Russia. And it has often acted as a mediator between Europe and Russia. So whichever of those two entities, the West or Russia, has greater influence over Turkey, is at an advantage. Right. So what did we mark in 2014? We see Erdogan coming in as president in 2014. And he begins to act as a dictator. We spoke about Erdogan's history from 2014 to the present. That we see him consolidating his power in Turkey. Right. And we see this taking place in two phases. Right, because he was threatened by a corruption investigation. He responded to this challenge to his power by purging the government. He removed all possible opposition from his government. Not just the government, but the civil service, the police force, the media. Right? He got rid of everybody who could have challenged him and consolidated power in himself and his party. Then we see in 2016 that there was a failed coup against him. And this failed coup became a pretext for a second purge, where he went further in terms of consolidating power in him and his party. So we see Erdogan acting as a dictator. And we also made note of the direction in which he has taken his country, which is towards right-wing nationalism. So now we come to 2019, where we see a significant conflict between the West and Turkey. Right, Turkey is a member of NATO, the military alliance of Western nations. And NATO was created specifically to limit the influence of Russia. So we have Turkey, who is a NATO member, in 2019 shifting its allegiance to Russia. We see Turkey buying military technology from Russia, which leads to a conflict with the United States, And America's threats against Turkey led them to, at the very least, threaten to go further towards Russia. Right, so we see Turkey, an important sphere of influence, a country that has served as a mediator between the West and Russia, a country that is part of the military alliance of Western nations. In 2019, we see it shifting its alliance to Russia. So when we come to 2019, the King of the South has gained a victory in relation to this sphere of influence. And Erdogan was the man who brought this about, and we mark him in 2014. Right. The next sphere of influence that we covered was Ukraine, where in 2014 we see Russia annexing Crimea. What led to the annexation of Crimea? It's because Ukraine had rejected a deal from Russia and was moving towards the European Union. Right, and there was a pro-Russian government in Ukraine in 2014. And protests that were backed by the United States led to the overthrow of this government. Protests that were supported by the United States led to the overthrow of this government. And Russia's response to this development was to invade Crimea. So we have this war beginning in 2014. What developments do we see with Ukraine in 2019? Right, so Ukraine is an important sphere of influence. Both the United States and Russia are involved in seeking to control the direction that this country takes. But in 2019, we see that as a result of the scandal with Trump, the scandal that led to Trump's impeachment, where he was pressuring the president of Ukraine to start false investigations. Right, when this was exposed, we read passages to the effect that it was very damaging for the president of Ukraine. And he has since then sought to make a deal with Russia. Right. This morning I found another passage which makes this point. And it's a passage from the New York Times. It's called Zelensky's Opponents Fear He is Ready to Capitulate to Russia. And I won't read it because we've covered Ukraine already. But again, it's in the notes. Or if you're going to search for it, it's Zelensky's Opponents Fear He is Ready to Capitulate to Russia. And that's from the New York Times. And this article is just making the observation that Zelensky has been making concessions to Russia in preparation to making a peace deal, to end the war. And he's already made concessions to Russia. But there's a fear that he's going to make even greater concessions once Putin gets him alone in a room. And as soon as in December and last month there have been protests in Ukraine. by people accusing Zelensky of being a traitor. Because they're seeing that Russia is the one that is gaining from these developments that are taking place. Right, so in 2019, when we speak of Ukraine as a sphere of influence, we see Russia gaining over the United States. We see the king of the south winning over the king of the north. Right, then we came to Libya, where in 2014, we see the beginning of the Libyan civil war. Of course, we know that there were the Arab Spring protests, which began in 2011. And this eventually led to the civil war in 2014, which is marked in 2014. Libya is an important sphere of influence. The former leader of Libya, Gaddafi, was an ally of Putin. The West is concerned about Libya because it's oil rich. It's not only oil rich, but it is the gateway to Europe for these thousands of migrants that have been entering Europe over the last few years. And this immigration crisis, this migrant crisis, has been threatening the very existence of the European Union. Right, so Libya and who controls it then becomes important to both Russia and the United States, to both the king of the north and the king of the south. So 2014 we have the civil war opening. And in 2019 we see a development with Russia where it's extending its power in Libya. And it did this by introducing the Wagner group into that country. We spoke a bit about the Wagner group. What is it? It's a group of mercenaries. A mercenary is like a soldier for hire. A soldier who's not fighting for a national cause, they're fighting for profit. And they're part of a private army that can be hired by governments to come fight wars for them. But the thing with the Wagner group is that it's a non-state actor. It is not directly attached to the Russian government, but it is controlled by the Russian government. So what it allows is Russia can send troops into a country under this organization, which is effectively to declare war on a country. But it can deny responsibility because it says that group does not represent our government. Do you see that? Right. So in 2019, Russia is extending its influence in Libya by introducing this Wagner group. And they're fighting on the side of one of the factions in this conflict. Right, there are two factions. The faction in the east, which is led by General Haftar, and the faction in the West, which is led by a UN recognized government. That is recognized by the United Nations. So the Wagner Group intervenes in support of General Haftar. And General Haftar has he has met with success in his conflict against the Western government. As a matter of fact, he is besieging Tripoli. He's besieging the capital of the country, where the Western-backed government is located. The articles that we read yesterday pointed out what Russia's purpose is in Ukraine, in Libya. Right, it's simply to exert more control. Because if it controls Libya, it has greater influence over Europe. Because the Europeans are very anxious about the situation there. Because again, it's got oil, and it is the gateway for these migrants that are causing domestic political problems in these countries. So Libya, we see the civil war in 2014. In this area that's important to both Russia and the United States. And in 2019, we see Russia winning. Right? And an important development was the introduction of the Wagner Group. So we see that as far as this sphere of influence, Libya, in 2019, the King of the South is winning. He is gaining over the United States and the West. Right, so we're going to move away from this area to identify a sphere of influence in South America. Now, when we come to Venezuela, we see protests. We see protests leading up to 2014. Right? And in these protests, I guess it was protesting how shall I put it? The worsening conditions within the country. Right, the protest by a political parties against the government. And the government is led by Nicolas Maduro, a man called Nicolas Maduro. And Nicolas Maduro is the successor of Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez was a very close ally of Russia. Right, because, and their ties, the ties between, okay, Hugo Chavez was a very close ally of Russia. And Maduro maintained those alliances with Russia. So now you have protests in 2014. Protests from most prominently a right-wing political party. Which is backed by the West against the established government that is backed by Russia. Right? So the leader of this opposition party,
nti omukulembeze w'ekibiina ekiwakana
this party called the Popular Will Party,
ekibiina ekiyitibwa Popular Will Party
he's arrested in 2014 in connection with these protests.
akwatibwa mu 2014 oluvannyuma lw'okwekalakaasa
And he's put under house arrest.
n'ateekebwa mu busibe mu nnyumba.
Now, from 2014 onwards, the situation in Venezuela has continued to get worse.
nti okuva mu mwaka okugenda mu maaso embeera egenze ng'eyonooneka.
And there have been protests along the way.
era babadde okwekalakaasa okwa buli ngeri.
But when we come to 2019, we see a significant new development
lwatuuka mu 2011 tulabawo ekipya ekijja
where a man by the name of Juan Guaido,
tulaba mukulu Guaido
a man by the name of Juan Guaido, he is named the leader of the political party
nti afuna obukulembeze yaweebwa obukulembeze obw'ekibiina ekiwakanya
that had been at the forefront of the protest since 2014.
naye ng'abadde wakumwanjoonya okuva edda mu 2014.
Right, he was actually mentored by the former leader who was arrested in 2014.
mazima abadde nga ayigirizibwa omukulembeze ayakwatibwa mu 2014.
So we see this man Guaido in 2014,
tulaba omusajja ono Guaido okuva edda mu 2014
and we see him in 2019 as well,
ate tumulaba ne mu 2011
where he's now the leader of the party.
ate kati ye mukulembeze w'ekibiina ekiwakanya gavumenti eri mu bunyinza.
And in protests that took place in 2019,
okwekalakaasa okali mu 2019
Guaido declares himself the president.
nti Guaido era nga president.
He declares himself the president of Venezuela in competition with Maduro.
nti yerangira nga pulezidenti wa Venezuela ng'awakanya pulezidenti Maduro.
He was declaring that Maduro has failed to run the country. He's no longer a legitimate leader.
n'agamba nti Maduro alemereddwa okufuga ensi n'okulembera kati ye president.
What we see immediately following
kiki ekyo tulaba amawanga ekigobeera
was the United States and Western countries
nti America n'amawanga ag'emugwanjuba gonna
quickly coming to the support of Juan Guaido,
bavayo mangu ne bawagira omusajja ono Juan Guaido,
right? Because they wanted to see this leftist government,
baali baagala okulaba gavumenti eno
this socialist government,
nti gavumenti ya
socialist.
socialist.
They want to see this socialist government that was allied to Russia overthrown.
nti baagala gavumenti yakolagana ne Russia ebeere engejjibwamu obwesigo bwe esuulibwa.
And someone more favorable to the West put in his place.
era babeere ng'omuntu gabwagira yakwata oba yalinnya mu buyinza.
So you see the United States and other countries announcing support for Guaido's declaration.
tulaba nti America ebeera mabega w'okwerangira kwa Guaido nga president mu Venezuela.
And for a time, if you follow the developments in that country,
ekiseera bwe mbanga mbadde mugoberera ebintu ebadde ebeerawo mu nsi eyo,
if you're watching the news,
bwe mbanga mbadde mulaba amawulire,
it looked like these protests had such a momentum that Maduro was going to be overthrown.
nti mulaba nti okwekalakasa kuno kwatuuka ku mutendera nga Maduro yali agenda kuwanika abiveeko.
It looked inevitable.
nti kwali kulabika nga kusobola kudda mabega.
But today, Maduro is still in power.
naye paka leero Maduro akyali mu bukulembeze.
And it's Guaido's protest that has lost momentum.
era kati okwekalakasa kwa Guaido kugenze nga kugwamu amaanyi.
What was the catalyst? What made the change?
ki ekyayita enkyukakyuka okubeera nti ate kati ebintu bituuka mu ngeri bwetyo?
Well, you have Russia entering Venezuela.
tulaba Russia ng'eyingira direct mu Venezuela.
Russia interposed directly to save Maduro
nti Russia eyingirayo direct n'etandika okuba nga esobola okutaasa Maduro
and to keep him in power.
n'okuba nga bakyamukuumira mu ntebe.
It has done so by providing aid,
nti basooka n'okumuwa obuyambi.
right? Given that the country is going through a severe economic crisis,
naddala ensi bwe yali nga mu byenfuna eri mu mbeera nzibu,
not only by providing aid,
tebamuwa buyambi bwokka,
but it has sent troops to Venezuela.
era basiika ddala n'amagye gaabwe mu Venezuela.
And these troops have been given the specific mandate to protect Maduro.
nti era amagye gano gaweereddwa ekiragiro kyakuba nga gakuuma Maduro.
To protect him from anything that looks like a coup.
era nga ekigenda kyakuba nti bamuyamba okumutaasako bwekyo kyonna ekisobola okubeera nga kigendera kusobola gavumenti ye.
Right, so there are Russian troops in Venezuela right now.
era paka leero amagye ga Russia gali mu Venezuela.
Right? Russia's intervention has been critical
nti ensonga ya Russia okubanga eyingiramu ebadde ya nsonga nkulu nnyo
in keeping a Russian-backed government in power
okubanga ekuuma gavumenti gyewagira mu buyinza
and in shutting down, or I'll use that expression, in shutting down a Western-backed uprising.
era n'okubeera nti bakakaya n'okussa wansi okwekalakasa okwali kuwagirwa America n'emikwano gye.
So as you observe developments with Venezuela in 2019,
bw'obanga ogenze ng'otunuulira ebibadde beera mu Venezuela mu mwaka 2019
who's winning,
ani omuwanguzi kati
right? Who is gaining?
ani afunyeemu ennyo
The king of the south has met its goal
nti kabaka w'omumaserengeta akuumye ebiruubirirwa bye ne bituukirira
of preserving their ally.
n'asigaza mukwano gwe mu buyinza.
But the United States and the West have failed to meet their goal
America n'ebanywanyi be balemereddwa okuba nga beefuga
of seeing this government overthrown and one of their people put in.
era bayagala nti gavumenti y'amagulu ekyali mu kulembeze.
So in 2019, with this sphere of influence, who has won?
2019 ani awangudde mu Venezuela?
It's the king of the south,
Ye kabaka w'omumaserengeta.
right? Again, which is in line with our model
Ate nga kitambula ddala ne mu kifaananyi kyaffe wano
for the Battle of Raphia.
ku lutalo lw'e Raphia.
So that's Venezuela.
Bwetyo bw'eri Venezuela.
The sixth one we have is Africa.
Ey'omukaaga twalabye nti ye Africa.
Okay, let me do this. So, what takes place with Africa in 2019
Kyekituukawo mu Africa mu 2019
with the King of the South?
eri kabaka w'omumaserengeta.
Well, in terms of Africa as a sphere of influence, if I may say that.
Ng'ekifo ekirwanirwa okwefugwa.
To really understand this development in 2019,
Okutegeera eno embeera ebaddewo okutuuka mu 2019
we must put it within the context of what we see in 2014.
tulina okuba nga tutunuulira kye tulaba mu 2014.
In 2014, of course, we know that Russia invades Ukraine.
Mu mwaka ogutwalira Russia ng'erumba Ukraine,
What do the Western countries then do to Russia?
ensi ez'obugwanjuba zaakola ki eri Russia?
Right? They say it's the 21st century.
Nankwaye twagamba kikyasi ekyabirimu gumu.
We can't have a situation where a country just comes and takes a piece of another country.
Sobola kulaba nsi ng'ebavubye n'ekwata ekitundu kya nsi endala nekitwabutwazi bwekyo.
Right? The way they did during these wars of the Diadochi and so on and so
Era
forth.
ng'ebaakolanga mu ntalo zino ezaddayo ekibono endala zonna emabega.
Right? So saying we can't have that, we're going to put sanctions.
Ne bagamba tusobola kukkiriza mbeera bwe tugenda kuba nga tuteekako nati.
Right? So they impose sanctions on Russia,
Ne bateeka nati ku Russia.
economic sanctions.
Naddala nati ez'ebyenfuna.
And these sanctions have been very detrimental to the Russian economy.
Era mazima nati zino zigenze nga zifa ebya nnyo ebyenfuna bya Russia.
Right? But if the economy is bad at home,
Naye ebyenfuna biba nga bibi,
people suffer.
abantu babonaabona.
And if people are suffering,
Era ng'abantu bali kubonaabona,
they won't support the government.
tebagenda kuwagira gavumenti eyo.
Right? So it becomes important for Russia and Putin
Kiba kya mugaso nnyo eri Russia ne Putin
to find new ways to develop his economy,
nti okunoonya engeri endala ez'okuba nga azazaamu okukuza ebyenfuna mu ggwanga.
to find new opportunities for economic advancement.
Okulaba nti anoonya engeri endala zonna zasobola okuba nga asitula ebyenfuna.
So where does he look to?
Kati aba awe n'akola ki?
He looks to Africa.
Addukira mu Africa.
Right. So in 2019, so here in 2014 we have sanctions,
2019 tulaba nati,
and then we come to 2019
bwe tutuuka mu 2019
in an effort to open up new economic opportunities.
mu kufuba okulaba nga asobola okulaba nga anoonya engeri ey'okuzaayo ebyenfuna bye.
Russia conducts its first Russia-Africa summit.
Nti Russia kyesookerako lwe lukuŋŋaano lwa Russia lwali gaatu n'amanga gonna ag'omu Africa.
So I'm going to read some articles about this point.
agenda kusoma article y'amawulire.
This is from an article from the Business Insider,
Article agenda kuva mu Business Insider,
the news publication Business Insider,
eryoggulire.
and it's called Vladimir Putin is looking unstoppable after a string of victories that Trump handed to him on a plate. I'll say it again. Vladimir Putin is looking unstoppable
Nti Vladimir Putin alabise okuba nga kisobola kuyimirizibwa
after a string of victories that Trump handed him on a plate.
nti oluvannyuma lw'obuwanguzi Trump bwe yamufunako emabega.
Right, so this is in your notes as well. So it's listing a series of victories that Putin has gained in 2019.
Tulaba obuwanguzi bw'azze ng'afuna mu mwaka gwa 2019. Twogera ku Putin.
They make the point that 2019 was a great year for Putin.
Nti era 2019 gwali mwaka gwa nkizo na buwanguzi eri Putin.
As far as increasing Russia's influence on the world stage.
Naddala okubeera nga Russia amaanyi gayo eyongera okuba nga egawanika eri ensi.
And one of those victories that it cites is the Russian expansion into Africa.
Era emu ku maanyi ge bwe kuba nga Russia eyongera okubeera n'enkizo n'emmanga ga Africa.
So it says, highlighted in this week's first Russia-Africa summit,
Ku nsonga y'olukiiko lwaliwo Russia n'emmanga ga Africa
has shown the world a desire to cement Russia's economic influence.
nti era gyalala ensi nti Russia nkakafu n'okuba nga eyongera okulaga enkizo yaayo.
The Soviet Union used to have a major presence on the continent,
Nti Soviet Union emabega yalina enkizo mu mawanga aga Africa,
but that has decreased since the end of the Cold War.
nti naye ekyo kyakoma oluvannyuma lw'olutalo olw'ebigambo olwaliwo.
Whether it is through diamond extraction or arms sales in Madagascar. Okay. Hang on. Whether it's through diamond extraction or arms sales in Madagascar,
Naddala ku nsonga ezazikwatagana n'ekizinga Madagascar
or energy deals in Nigeria or Libya,
oba eri ensi ya Nigeria oba ne Libya,
the Russians are showing themselves to be an increasing force to be reckoned with.
nti era Russia esobola okuba nga eyongeza amaanyi gayo mu mawanga ago.
So that whole article is worth reading.
Bwetyo bwegenda ng'ennyina.
Right, you have this first Russia-Africa summit,
Tusooka ntulaba olukiiko lwa Russia nga lulimu n'abakulembeze b'Afrika.
all 54 countries are invited.
Amanga gonna 54 gayitibwa.
Over $100 billion worth of deals are signed.
Era ne billions of money ne ziikanyizibwako.
And the effect of this is to magnify Russia's power,
Ekiruubirira kyakino kuba nti Russia erabika nga yankizo waggulu era nga yeefuga Africa.
right? Or the image of its power.
Era okuba nga egendera kulaga amaanyi gaayo mu nsi za Africa.
That Russia can command so much influence
Nti Russia esobola okuba nga eragira n'ebeera n'eddoboozi eddene mu Africa.
and to create such trade opportunities.
N'okuba nga etandika okuteekawo obusuubuzi n'amawanga ga Africa.
Right, so we have the first Russia-Africa summit in 2019.
Tusooka okubeera n'olukiiko lwa Russia n'amawanga ga Africa mu 2019.
And on the world political stage, it's a real power move, as they call it.
Era ekyo kino ky'amaanyi okutunuulira eri amawanga gonna ag'ensi.
Right, it's Russia projecting its power.
Era gano Russia eba eraga amaanyi gaayo.
Right, so in 2019,
2019
as far as Africa as a sphere of influence,
otunuulira ku bifo ebirwanirwa okuba nga bisinzibwamu enkizo.
we see Russia gaining.
Tulaba nti Russia etandise okuba nga efuna obuwanguzi.
We see Russia gaining and the West losing in another way.
Tulaba nga Russia efuna obuwanguzi ate ab'ebugwanjuba batandika okuba nga bafiirwa.
Because what is Putin?
Putin kyeki.
Right? If you look at Putin's friends,
Bw'otunula Putin ne banywanyi be,
right? Firstly, what is Putin?
Putin kyeki.
He's a dictator.
Nakyemalira.
His friend in Syria, what is he?
Mukwano gwe musimu ogwa Suuliyani. Naye dictator.
He's a dictator. His friend in Turkey, what is he?
Mukwano gwe mu Buturuki muki. Naye nakyemalira.
He's a dictator. His friend, the former leader of Libya, what was he?
Pulezidenti wa Libya yavaako yali ki? Yali dictator.
His friend in Venezuela that he's keeping there, what is he?
Mukwano gwe Venezuela naye muki. Naye nakyemalira.
He's a dictator. What is Africa full of?
Africa ejjudde baani bannakyemalira bonna.
It's full of dictators. And dictators generally don't have respect for human rights.
nti banakyemmalira bano tebassa mu kitiibwa ddembe ly'obuntu.
They are mired in corruption,
basajja bali bambuzi.
right? And the problem with the West
obuzibu n'ensi ez'ebuvanjuba
is that when it comes to make a deal,
yabajja naawe okuba nga mukola endagaano
or when it comes to give aid,
oba bw'oba ng'ozze okuweebwa obuyambi
there are conditions,
kubeerako obukwakulizo,
there are strings attached.
kubeerako ebigendera ku buyambi obwo.
Like in Uganda, I'm pretty sure I've read about this,
Mu Uganda mukakafu nti yali kyasomako
where they say things like, in order to receive this aid package,
nti okuba nga musobola okufuna obuyambi buno
we want to see the human rights situation for LGBTQ people improve.
tulina okulaba nti abantu bageebwa eddembe buli omu okweyisa nga bw'ayagala.
Right? You see that it happened to Zimbabwe as well.
Mukiraba bulungi ekyo.
Right? Or they'll say, if you want in order for this deal that you want to go through,
Ndiyo n'okulaba nga kusaidiyo eyitawo
we want to see improvement in your anti-corruption efforts.
tulina okulaba nga otandika tulaga nti lwandisa enguzi ate nga tulabira ddala nga
Right? So the African leaders don't like that.
ate kyo abakulembeze b'omu Afrika tebabyagala.
So what's the advantage with Russia?
Russia erina nkizo kyabo.
Is Russia asking about human rights?
Russia esooka kubuuza nti waliyo eddembe ly'obuntu.
Is asking about LGBTQ,
Abuuza ku nsonga nti simanyi abantu ganza okulya ebisyago oba nedda.
corruption, fair elections?
Nti oba aliwo okulonda okuli feeyo oba nedda.
It's not asking any of that.
Russia ebyo tebibuuza.
It's just saying, let's do business.
Russia egambagambye ka tukole business.
Right? So that is also, and China's the same way.
Ate ne China bwekyo kweri.
That is why on the African continent,
Bwe tunuulira kontinenti ya Africa,
you're seeing a growth in influence.
mulaba okwefuga kwabwe n'amaanyi gabe nga
You're seeing an increased presence
mulaba okwongera okubeerawo okwa Russia
of Russia and China.
nti abarussia n'abachina batandise okuba nga beefuga Africa.
But here we're looking at Russia specifically.
Naye tugamba kutunuulira ku Russia kuba y'ensonga.
Right? We're seeing Russia gaining in Africa and the West losing.
Tulaba nti Russia etandise okufuna enkizo ey'amaanyi ate America n'ebanywanyi batandise okuba nga bongera okufiibwa.
So when we look at these 6 spheres of influence that we've covered,
Olumya ku bifo mukaaga betuzize nga tunula ntumaliza
on all of them,
ng'era byonna
in fulfillment of the model,
bwe tunuulira ku kifaananyi kitulaba eno
we have the king of the south winning against the king of the north.
tulaba kabaka w'omu maserengeta ng'awangula kabaka w'omu mambuka.
So the question then is, do we see the fulfillment of the battle of Raphia?
Ekibuzo kiba ki tulaba okutuukira ku lutalo lw'e Raphia.
The answer is, if you're willing to do the research to dig,
Ansa eri bweti obanga olimumalivu okubeera nti ogenda kunyeezera osiime ennyo
to go into the history, to go into the news websites,
ogende mu byafaayo ogende olabe amawulire gabyogerako bitya
and understand what has happened in each of these countries politically,
era ng'otandika okunoonyereza kiki ekigenda mu maaso mu nsonga y'obufuzi mu mawanga ago
I think you'll see certainly Russia has won the battle of Raphia.
era nga mutuufu mutwalo Raphia Russia muwanguzi.
Now, we have a number of lines or models that teach us about this waymark.
Tulina ebyokulabirako bingi ebisobola okutuyigiriza waymark eyo.
One of them is Raphia and Panium, which is part of the Syrian wars.
Nti ekimu ye Raphia ne Panium emu ku ntalo ezirwanirwa mu Bwasuli.
Another line is the Pyrrhic wars,
Ekiddako ye Pyrrhic Wars.
Um,
Entalo ezo.
right? The wars of Pyrrhus.
Naddala mu ntalo za Pyrrhus.
And we can lay the Pyrrhic wars upon our line.
Tuyinza okukwata entalo za Pyrrhus ne tuteeka ku layini yaffe.
When we do that,
Bwe tukola ekyo,
2019
bwe tukola ekyo mu 2019
is Asculum.
nti ebeera Ascalon.
The Battle of Asculum that Pyrrhus fought against Rome.
Lubeera olutalo lwa Ascalon Pyrrhus olwana ne Rumi.
And Panium,
Ate Panium
where Pyrrhus finally met his defeat,
nti Pyrrhus wawangulwa
is 2021.
2021.
Now, Beneventum, yes.
Si Panium naye Beneventum.
It looked funny. Beneventum.
Sipanium naye badde Beneventum.
Now, in the line of Pyrrhus, Pyrrhus is the king of the south and Rome is the king of the north.
Ye kabaka w'omumaserengeta ate agenda kwalaga ne kabaka w'omumambuka.
Right? And just as Pyrrhus wins Asculum and loses at Beneventum,
Bw'afiira ku Ascalum, bw'awangula ku Ascalum, naye n'awangula ku Beneventum.
we see the king of the south winning at Raphia and losing at Panium.
Tulaba kabaka w'omumaserengeta nga ku Raphia awangula ate ku Panium ava ku Beneventum n'awangulwa.
But each of these lines feed new information into our understanding of the Weimar.
Byonna bituwa obukakafu okukakasa 2019.
The Syrian wars are bringing out this aspect of spheres of influence.
Entalo z'Esiriya zitulaga okulwanira ebifo nga bwe twalabye.
But what information can we glean from the Pyrrhic wars?
Naye kiki kye tusobola okuyiga mu ntalo za Pyrrhus?
We know that Pyrrhus, although he defeated Rome
Newankubadde Pyrrhus awangula Rumi
at Asculum,
ku Ascalum,
it was what we call a Pyrrhic victory.
tuyite obuwanguzi bwa Pyrrhus.
Right? And that expression, Pyrrhic victory,
Ekiraga obuwanguzi bwa Pyrrhus
it's a victory that you gain at tremendous cost to yourself.
nti bwe buwanguzi bw'ofa naye nga ofiiriddwa kumpi weewaddeyo wenna.
Right? Where you defeat your opponent, but you're just as badly hurt.
Nti owangula omulabe wo naye ng'ate omwesi mufaanagana.
Right. So when we look at 2019,
Tutunuulira 2019,
we want to see whether these victories that Russia has gained in 2019, whether they are Pyrrhic victories.
twagala kutunula obuwanguzi bwa Russia oba obuwanguzi bwa Pyrrhus.
And the answer to that, if we look at the record of the recent history, is that they are.
Bwe tutunuulira ku byafaayo, ebyafaayo bikulaga nti bwe kiti.
Right. There are a couple of articles that we can look at that communicate this.
Bingi bisobola okuba nga tusoma okukakasa ekyo.
One is from the Washington Post,
Ekimu kiva mawulire ag'ekiva Washington Post.
and it's called Putin touts Russia as a great power, but he's made it a weak one.
Nti Putin alaga Russia okubeera eggwanga ery'amaanyi naye ate ng'alinafuya.
Right. So we'll read portions of this. It says, from Venezuela to Syria to Ukraine,
Okuva e Venezuela obwa Suuli ne Ukraine,
Moscow is playing an assertive role in global affairs. Russia is playing an assertive role.
nti Russia etandise okuba nga erina yeefuga ebitundu ebyo.
Observers often give Vladimir Putin the credit for bringing Russia back as a force.
Abatunuulizi bakoonyeddemu Vladimir Putin okulaba nti akomezaawo Russia ku maapi.
Despite his country's acknowledged weakness.
Newankubadde ensi ye tekiwagira ekyo.
So this article is making the point that although Russia has made these gained these important victories on the world stage,
Newankubadde Russia egenze onafuna obuwanguzi mu ndaba y'ensi yonna,
it is still fundamentally a weak country.
naye ekyali nsi nna.
And it's going to explain why.
Agenda kunnyonnyola lwaki kiri bwe kityo.
It says the failure to create a more dynamic economy is the root of the problem.
Okulemererwa okuteekawo ebyenfuna ebirungi y'ensimuko ya byonna.
Thanks to high energy prices,
Oluvannyuma lw'okuba nti amasannyalaze gali ku miwendo gya waggulu,
the Kremlin has accrued large reserve funds.
nti gavumenti yegyasinze okuba nga erina nti yeteekawo ensimbi ez'enkizo kugula amafuta,
But the economy has stagnated for a decade.
naye ate ebyenfuna bigenze nga bisereba ate nga biserera ddala.
When he returned to the presidency in 2012,
Bw'otuuka ku bukulembeze mu 2012,
Putin promised 6% growth per year.
nti yasuubiza okwongeza byenfuna okwongeza 6 buli 100 mu byenfuna abamu kusasula.
But the Russian economy is now about the same size as it was in 2008.
Naye ate eri wansi naye almost tewaliwo njawulo bw'otunula ne mu kiseera kino.
And makes the point that people's incomes are going down.
Kikulaga bulungi nti enfuna y'abantu egenze ng'ekuleba ng'eka wansi nnyo.
So it's saying that these victories that have been gained in 2019,
Obuwanguzi bwagenze ng'afuna mu 2019,
from Syria to Libya to Venezuela.
nti okuva e Syria, Libya ne Venezuela,
Anyway, they've not made Russia stronger.
nti tefudde Russia kubeera nti y'amaanyi.
Russia is still a weak country.
Ng'era Russia ekyali nsi ennafu,
And it's because its economy at home is still weak.
lwakuba nti ebyenfuna byayo bikyali wansi nnyo,
Now it's going to point out the second cause for Russia's continued weakness.
nti agenda kulaga point erayiraga obunafu bwa Russia ate.
And it says, Putin's foreign policy has led to reactions that have ultimately limited Russia's power.
Nti enkolagana ya Putin n'amawanga amalala ereese embeera ennafu ya Russia.
The annexation of Crimea brought a 4-year surge in support for Putin within Russia.
Nti okukubula Crimea n'egigatta ku Russia,
The annexation of Crimea brought a 4-year rise in support for Putin in Russia.
nti okukomyawo Crimea kyamuwa obuwagizi emyaka ena ng'awagirwa ekikola kye yakola.
But it also removed the largest and most pro-Russian voting bloc from Ukrainian politics.
Naye ate era kyamusalako era ne kyongera enkiza abaali bamwakanya.
On top of that,
Waggulu w'ekyo,
Moscow's actions in Ukraine have reinvigorated NATO.
bw'otunuulira ebintu mu Moscow bigenze nga byonoonekera ddala.
They've reinvigorated NATO. Yeah, reinvigorate is to wake up.
Okay. Tibigenze nga ate bisitula okuwakanya okuva mu NATO.
And led to economic sanctions that have further slowed Russia's economic growth.
Ekivuddeyo okuba nga Russia eteekebwako nati negiranyika okuba nga kikozimbya ebyenfuna byayo.
Right. And then it goes on to list a paragraph where it says we should commend Putin's skill
Tuyinza okwogera ku magezi ga Putin
in the victories that he's gained in Syria
mu buwanguzi bwafunye mu Bwasuli
and in the Middle East
ne mu kino kya Buwalabu
and with Turkey
n'eri Buturuuki
and with Venezuela.
ne mu Venezuela,
And it says this is an impressive record.
nti eyo ensonga esimibwa.
But it then says in the next paragraph,
Naye ate mu paragraph eddako bagamba
but in other areas, Putin's policies have produced short-term victories that limit Russian power in the long run.
nti ate mu bifo ebirala obuwanguzi bwa Putin bugenze waliwo kyebukosezza mu kubeera nti akyefuga ebitundu ebyo mu bbanga erijja mu maaso.
When we look at Pyrrhus, he won the Battle of Asculum. There was a short-term victory.
Bwetunulira Pyrrhus yawangula olutalo lwe Ascalon, obuwanguzi bwe bwali bulabikwa,
But in the long run, he was weaker for it.
naye ate oluvannyuma yanafuwa.
Right? So here, Putin has won these victories.
Nti Putin awangudde entalo, afunye obuwanguzi obwo,
He's won these battles.
awangudde entalo ezo,
But this analysis is making the point that he's the weaker for it in the long run.
nti naye okunoonyeza kugamba nti oluvannyuma ate ebino bigenda kumunafuya.
Right? So this is a useful article.
An article nkulu nnyo.
Another one is by foreignpolicy.com.
Guno omukulu guyita foreignpolicy.com.
And the article, it says, Putin lost his African game before he started.
Nti Putin nga tanaba kutandika kulwana kuzza Africa ate yali amaze okufiirwa.
Right? It says Putin lost his African great game before he started.
Nti omuzannyo gwe yatandika mu Africa yawangulwa nga tanaba naagutandika aguzannya.
And this article is making the point that since 2014
Nti okuva mu 2014
and the sanctions Russia suffered in 2014,
nti nenati ezateekebwa ku Russia mu mwaka ogwo,
Putin's been looking for new markets.
nti Putin abadde anoonya obutale obupya,
He's turned to Africa in a strong way
nti akoma mu Africa n'amaanyi mangi
by launching this Russia-Africa summit.
ng'ataakawo olukiiko olugatta amanga Africa ne Russia.
But it points out that as you really investigate what came out of this summit,
Naye bw'otunuulira n'eriserenka ekyava mu lukiiko luno,
it's not that strong a development.
nti era si kyamaanyi nnyo bw'otunuulira.
Like, I'll just say this.
Ngera bw'agambye.
It says, speaking of the summit, it says it hasn't had much effect.
Nti oluvannyuma lw'olukiiko tewaliwo kyamaanyi kyalabika.
Today, only 3.7% of Russian goods end up in Africa. Today, only 3.7%.
Nti leero obutundu 3 buli 10 ebintu ebiyingira mu Africa, ebintu bya Russia ebiyingira mu Africa.
Right. And it says only 1.1% of African goods are exported to Russia.
Era kimu ku 10 ebintu ebiva mu Africa ebitundibwa mu Russia.
It says this summit was supposed to change this, but there hasn't been much change. It makes the point that it's true. I said over 100 billion. It's actually 12.5 billion. It says it's true $12.5 billion in deals were signed. But most of them were only memorandums of understanding. That may never actually be fulfilled. Right, and it goes on to explain why this situation existed. So we've identified from the Battle of Raphia that in 2019 it has been fulfilled. As we examine the conflict over spheres of influence between Russia and the United States. We've also identified the element of the Pyrrhic victory from the line of Pyrrhus. And we see that the secular record confirms that Russia's victories here, they're Pyrrhic victories, they're short term. Right. So again, that which we've been teaching at least since 2016, in connection with Raphia and Pania, and what we've been teaching with the lines of Pyrrhus under the midnight cry, I think we've demonstrated that these things are correct. They've come to pass. But again, in order to do that work, in order to do the work of connecting the prophecy to the fulfillment, we have to dig. Right? We have to really study what has taken place with the subject of the prophecy. Whether it's the king of the north, the king of the south, or its spheres of influence around the world. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our consideration of the Battle of Raphia. And we'll continue on to another subject in our next study. Let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the ground that we've been able to cover. We thank you for the fulfillment of prophecy. We thank you that your word is true and you confirm that which you have spoken. Please strengthen our confidence in your truth and our confidence in you as our leader. Lord, we ask for your blessing upon the remainder of this day at the camp, and your continued blessing upon this camp meeting as we continue on from day to day. Thank you, Lord, for your goodness toward us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.